Begin. Hello, this is Jim Brinkley from the University of Washington. I'm sorry nobody from our group could be here today, but I'm going to be talking about the ontology of craniofacial development and malformation, or OCDM. This is a collaboration between myself, Onar Mahino, and Todd Detweiler from the Structural Informatics Group at the University of Washington, and Tim Cox and Michael Cunningham from the Craniofacial Center at the Seattle Children's Research Institute. The goals of this project are to create an ontology for use by FaceBase and other craniofacial communities. This consists of a set of standardized terms for annotation and retrieval by keyword search, and also a set of relations to allow intelligent integration and representation of knowledge. As we know, FaceBase consists of multiple types of studies from multiple sources. So if terms from the OCDM are used to annotate these data, then the terms as well as relationships in the OCDM can be used to relate the data along anatomical dimension, and terms and relations from other ontologies can be used to relate the data along other types of dimensions. The principles of the OCDM are that it's based on human anatomy and development, particularly on our foundational model of anatomy, which has now become the primary ontology for representing human anatomy. We utilize existing ontologies as much as possible, and it's modular. And an example of the modularity is this overall schematic of the OCDM. We start with the human ontology, and then there is a mouse and zebrafish, and then within those there are sub-ontologies for different aspects. So at the beginning we have the adult and developmental normal anatomy for all three species. So that is the craniofacial human ontology, craniofacial human development ontology, mouse ontology, mouse developmental ontology, and the same for zebrafish. This is a slide showing the protege screenshots from the protege ontology editor developed at Stanford, which we're using to create the ontology. We have the FMA for human, the craniofacial mouse ontology, and the zebrafish ontology. And within that, we have a so-called classification hierarchy, which organizes structures by classification, or so it's called is a hierarchy. And we have an anatomical structure divided into two kinds: a developmental structure and a postnatal anatomical structure. The developmental structures are the developmental hierarchy for the three ontologies, for the three species, are the developmental component. And this, plus many relations, allows us to represent in the computer, say, the derivation of the mandible all the way from the zygote by various using terminologies and as well as relationships between them. Then we have the mappings between these adult terms, the ones in black letters here. These are the craniofacial human mouse mappings ontology and the craniofacial human zebrafish mappings ontology. These are several different kinds of mappings. There's bi-directional one-to-one, meaning that the same structure is present in both species. The skull is present in the human and the mouse. The zebrafish skull is present also in the human. And then there's one-to-null mapping, where a structure is present in the human but not in the mouse or the zebrafish, in this case the uvula. And this can go in the other direction, where we have the intermolar eminence in the mouse is not present in the human, and the brachystegal ray in the zebrafish is not present in the human. There are also one-to-many mappings, where we have the frontal bone in the human, which is fused together, but the bones are not fused in the mouse, so the frontal bone in the human maps to three different structures in the mouse. Here's an example of representing the human mouse mapping ontology in protege. On the left we have the parietal bone in the human, and that maps to the parietal bone in the musculus on the right, upper right there. Then the next ontology we have is the craniofacial human malformations ontology, and similar for the mouse and the zebrafish. These ontologies here, and these are organized according to under an overall category of pathological entity. And one of those entities would be craniosynostosis in the human and in the mouse. And then we just talk about mappings between these malformations. We have the human mouse malformation mappings ontology and the human zebrafish malformation mappings ontology. And here is the craniosynostosis in the human and craniosynostosis in the mouse on the right. And this is the way we actually enter these mappings. We choose a source class, craniosynostosis, and a target class. These are already entered. We describe the mapping type, the source, and the target species. The reviewer, Tim Cox, our collaborator from Children's, and whether this is actually reviewed by the expert, and then an associated reference. And then we generate the mapping, and that goes in the protege. Here's another example, which is cleft palate in the human maps to the anterior neurocranium cleft in the zebrafish. So it's not all purely lexical matching. So all these different sub-ontologies create a very large property network or relation network. So for example, we can see that agenesis of the mandible on the upper left here is located in the mandible, and that agenesis of the mandible maps to agenesis of the mandible in the mouse, and that is located in the mouse mandible. The mandible has parts, body, and ramus, and the body of the mandible is the location of agenesis of the body of the mandible in the human. And so we also can show that the mandible derives from the ectomesenchyme of the first pharyngeal arch in the lower left here, and that ectomesenchyme also derives the zygomatic bone, the malleus and the maxilla, and the maxilla is the location of agenesis of the maxilla. So this is actually a very large number of terms and relations, which allows us to do trace through these relations to basically do intelligent queries and searches by following these relations to relate data that's annotated with terms that may not be obviously related to each other. These sub-ontologies were delivered as our milestones over the 5 years of this grant. In the first year, we did some technical development, and then worked on the musculoskeletal system of the head for all 3 species. Then in year 2, the embryonic development of the head. Starting in year 3, the mappings, and then year 4, craniofacial malformations, human, mouse, and zebrafish, and then we've just recently finished malformation mappings for human to mouse and human to zebrafish, which was our last deliverable. So then these have been delivered as OWL files. OWL is the representation language for the semantic web. And now that we have these are our deliverables, but we've also like to suggest potential uses for this very detailed representation. One use would be representation of knowledge. Pathway databases, many of you probably have used. They are actually used. It can be used to represent actual knowledge of pathways, and they can be computed because they're used to infer basic pathways, because they are represented in the same way we do, often in OWL. And the same way, the kinds of developmental pathways that are being learned about in this kind of research are getting very complicated, and so this would be one way of representing some of that knowledge that's being gained in the computer. Another more immediate use would be data integration through knowledge, first through controlled terms, which is just keyword terms, but also through these so-called intelligent or knowledge-based queries. The terms are the primary way that the OCDM has been used by FaceBase, the hub so far, as FaceBase metadata. They have used terms not only from the OCDM, but also from many other external ontologies, as we have also used them within OCDM. But we are also, now this has not happened yet, but it could be in a future work. We have been trying to show some potential use for knowledge-based queries by tracing through these relations. So what we've been doing, in addition to creating these OWL files, is creating an infrastructure for creating and delivering the OCDM, and for making the OCDM queryable over the web so other applications could ask questions of it, and then showing a proof of concept of one such application, which is the OCDM Browser. We've had various versions of it, and then proof of concept potential uses of the OCDM within this new browser. So the first issue is making the OCDM queryable over the web. As I said, the OCDM consists of a set of OWL files. Todd Detweiler in our group has written a program to turn those into essentially a database called an RDF store, which is like a relational database, but it's meant for ontologies, and that in turn is accessed by a Sparkle endpoint. Sparkle is the query language for the semantic web. It's sort of like SQL for relational databases. That endpoint itself is a web service that can be accessed by many other applications, and there are many other ontologies that also have Sparkle endpoints, which allows these all to tie together. And so here's the RDF store on the Sparkle endpoint, and one such application that can access this endpoint is our OCDM Browser version 2, which allows you to basically browse through the OCDM and also show other examples of information that can be related by it. So here's a picture of how you use it. This is a JavaScript application, and I can provide a link for it. You basically might search for, say, the skull. Since we have 3 species, you have to choose which species you want. In this case, we might select human. Here we have the human skull. On the left side, we have the classification hierarchy. So the skull is a subdivision of the axial skeletal system, which eventually is a anatomical structure, which is a human entity. On the second panel in the middle there, it's the part of a hierarchy, and you can show many different kinds of relations, just as that we're choosing this one. So the skull is a part of the skeletal system of the head, and then on the right side is a description tab, basically, which shows more detail about the skull. Now you notice on the top there's description, and then FaceBase images and scenes. So this browser can be basically added panes that allow you to look at different components. So here we were just looking at description, but we can now say if we had worked on scenes, we can see a 3D scene that's interactive, that is generated by a program we developed for a separate project called the Dynamics, or a scene generator, which basically uses queries to the OCDM and FMA to build up a 3D scene that can be interacted with. So that's one example, and the other another one would be if you'd like to maybe find data from FaceBase that's annotated with parts of the OCDM. Most of the data in FaceBase are annotated not with human, but with mouse data. So we might want to find the mouse skull. And so we can click on where the human maps to the skull mus musculus. Click on that, and we have skull mus musculus. And then the panel for FaceBase lights up because the system has gone out to an experimental version of the FaceBase API, or Application Program Interface, that allows outside applications to access FaceBase data. And we haven't been able to keep that going because that's changed on us, but that would be another potential use in general for FaceBase, not only to allow people to go directly to the hub, but allow other applications like this one to contact it as a service. So this is just an example of how that might be. So you have these different data sets that are annotated with skull from the FaceBase. You can click on one of those and then go directly to a FaceBase page for that. Another one is the images pane, and this one instead of going to the hub, we went to the laboratory of Yang Chai, who has made many nice images available for the mouse, which are annotated with terms that these standardized terms, and these can be searched and retrieved. And so this is an exact match for the skull, one of the examples of one of his images that are annotated with skull. But we also might like to find related images. So one way to do that is to realize that the skull is part of the skeletal system of the head. So we can go to that, and we see that that has many different parts, among which is mandible on the lower right there. If we click on mandible, we can see that there are other images from Yang Chai's lab that are annotated with mouse mandible. And what we might like to do, though, instead of having to go through all these clicks to find related images, we might like to get the computer to do it for us. And so for that we have the exact matches for images for skull and for mandible. But to relate these two, we can look at the ontology to realize that the skull is part of the skeleton of the head, and the skeleton of the head has part mandible, which I just showed. So what we've done is created what's so-called knowledge patterns, which are queries to the Sparkle endpoint that basically automate this procedure of navigating, clicking on the different parts. And so here we start with a specific part, and we say the skull, and we find we follow these links of different part properties to find related terminology, and then we find if any data are annotated with those terms, and then present them all. So this is just basically pattern to look at subparts, but you can also have patterns to look at development and other kinds of relations among those many that I've already shown. So in this case, we're showing that you clicked on skull and found exact matches of images for the skull and for the related parts in this by means of the part knowledge pattern, showing the mandible, and then related by means of development, showing other developmental structures. So this is just a simple example of how you might be able to use these ontological relationships to find related information without having to know how to do all the search. And you can imagine extending this to development, down to finding related data, giving data starting from, say, clinical syndrome like craniosynostosis, finding all the associated anatomical structures, places where they develop from, associated mappings to model organisms, and then find related genomic data. So this is just an example of how these kind of things might be used in the future to make more intelligent searches. So in summary, what I've shown is the OCDM is a very rich, detailed set of terms and relations, which encompasses human, mouse, and zebrafish. It ranges from clinical to research, gross anatomy to genomic. It links to existing standard ontologies, but it supplements these ontologies when more details and relations are needed. As far as we know, it's the most detailed for craniofacial, of course, because we were funded to do that for 5 years, and so we hope it'll be used by others in the future. So our plans are to maintain and add some new content over time. We'll keep that Sparkle endpoint going so other applications can make queries to the OCDM. That endpoint will be updated daily whenever changes are made to the OCDM. We will release periodic releases, and the browser code is available in open source on GitHub, so that if anybody's interested in seeing an example of how you can use this data to build applications, that they can look at this code or extend it. If you want further information, there's an article about that. There's the FaceBase page. There's our own structural informatics group page. Here's context for myself and Onur Mahino. And here's the latest release of the OCDM. Here's how to access the browser and the browser source code at GitHub. Thank you very much.